Have you ever looked back at a situation from a few years ago and wondered why you stayed so long? Or why you let a certain comment slide without saying a word? It usually does not happen all at once. Growth is quiet, almost imperceptible in the moment, until one day you realize the atmosphere you live in has completely changed. You start noticing that things that used to feel normal, the slight disrespect disguised as humor, the constant obligation to accommodate everyone else's emotional state, the subtle pressure to minimize your own needs, suddenly feel unbearably uncomfortable. You begin to realize that peace of mind is not a luxury or something you are willing to trade just to keep things smooth for everyone else. Think back to the earlier versions of yourself. How many times did you sit in silence, swallowing your true reaction, just to keep the room calm? How many times did you adjust your schedule, your tone of voice, or your personal expectations just to make sure someone else did not feel challenged? In those stages, tolerating discomfort felt like a virtue. We often mistake patience for self-sacrifice, believing that if we are just understanding enough, patient enough, or accommodating enough, the dynamics around us will naturally smooth out. But when you begin doing the quiet work of self-respect, the lens through which you view those moments changes completely. You stop measuring your value by how much friction you can absorb. You realize that endurance is not always a sign of strength. Sometimes it is simply a habit of allowing things that erode your sense of clarity. The moment you begin honoring your personal reality, the cost of staying silent becomes too high. You notice the precise instant a boundary is tested, not with anger or hostility, but with a quiet, internal clarity that says, "This no longer works for me." It shows up in small, daily choices. It is the decision to end a phone call when the conversation turns into a one-sided vent session. It is the choice to say a firm, polite no to an event you have no capacity to attend, without spending 3 days feeling guilty about it. It is standing in a room and letting an uncomfortable silence sit, rather than rushing in to fix a mood that isn't yours to fix. The shift is not about becoming cold, distant, or unapproachable. It is about recognizing that your energy is finite, and that preserving your internal balance is the foundation for everything else you build in life. When you raise your personal baseline, the world around you reacts. Some people may be surprised when you no longer accept the roles you used to play. They might miss the version of you that was always available, always agreeable, and always willing to bend. But that resistance is simply proof that the boundary was necessary in the first place. You learn to let people have their reactions without making those reactions your responsibility to manage. As we begin this conversation today, drop a message in the comments with this affirmation: I honor my growth and respect my boundaries. Let that be your commitment to yourself today, as we explore how raising your standards is a natural, necessary part of moving forward and protecting the quiet stability you have worked so hard to cultivate. There was likely a time when you felt the compelling need to justify every single decision you made, every boundary you set, and every moment of rest you took. If you could not make it to a social event, you might have sat down and written a lengthy, multi-paragraph text message detailing every small obstacle, every minor headache, or every item on your schedule, all to prove that your absence was legitimate. If you needed space on a weekend to recharge, you spent immense internal energy carefully crafting your words, making sure the other person did not misunderstand your quietness as anger or personal rejection. You believed that if you could just construct the perfect explanation, complete with undeniable evidence, people would finally understand, respect your limits, and grant you permission to take care of yourself. This habit often comes from a deep-seated belief that your needs are not inherently valid on their own. You operate under the implicit assumption that your time, energy, and mental space belong to everyone else first, and that you must formally petition for the right to reclaim them. When you live this way, setting a boundary does not bring relief. It brings an exhausting wave of anxiety. You replay the conversation in your mind for hours, dissecting your tone, second-guessing your phrasing, and anticipating how the other person might react. You treat your own boundaries as a debate where you are the defense attorney, constantly presenting evidence to prove that you are not being unreasonable, selfish, or unkind. Over-explaining is an energetic drain that operates like a hidden tax on your daily life. Every time you offer an elaborate explanation for a simple choice, you invite the other person to evaluate, critique, or negotiate your reasons. If you tell someone you cannot do something because you are busy, they might try to help you reschedule or optimize your day to fit them in. If you tell them you do not have the budget for an outing, they might offer solutions or workarounds to bypass your constraint. By presenting a list of reasons instead of a clear decision, you accidentally turn a firm boundary into an open negotiation. You give away your authority and signal to others that your standard is open for discussion if they can just dismantle your arguments one by one. As you gain a clearer, more grounded sense of self, that frantic impulse to justify yourself begins to fade. You start to see that a simple, polite refusal is entirely complete on its own. You do not need to construct an elaborate defense wall just to protect your evening, your calendar, or your mental peace. The sentence, "I am not able to make it," contains all the clarity necessary for a healthy interaction. It is respectful, direct, and honest. You begin to understand that people who respect your presence will also respect your absence, without requiring a detailed transcript of your private life to grant that respect. Moving away from over-explaining requires practice and a willingness to sit with temporary awkwardness. The first few times you offer a brief, polite no without adding a long excuse, the silence that follows can feel heavy. Your old habits will push you to fill that silence with extra details, apologies, or softened qualifiers. But if you hold your position, you quickly discover something liberating. The scud does not fall. People accept the direct answer far more easily than you imagined, and the interaction moves on. You save yourself hours of overthinking and preserve a massive amount of cognitive energy that used to be burned on preemptive self-defense. Recognizing the true cost of over-explaining is one of the most transformative milestones in your personal development. It marks the transition from seeking external approval to relying on internal clarity. You stop viewing your boundaries as something you must convince others to accept, and start viewing them as standard guidelines for how you manage your life. When you reach this level of self-assurance, your communication becomes cleaner, your interactions become more honest, and your relationships gain a newfound level of mutual respect. You realize that your time and peace do not require a trial, a jury, or a detailed defense. They simply require your own steady commitment to honor them. Think about the sheer amount of time and effort you have poured into maintaining connections throughout your life. In the past, you were likely the person who reliably held everything together. You were the one always reaching out first, checking in after a long week, keeping track of birthdays, organizing plans, and driving the conversation forward. If there was a minor disagreement or a sudden shift in tone, you immediately stepped up to smooth things over, taking full responsibility for bridging whatever emotional distance had opened up. It is extraordinarily easy to fall into the habit of carrying the entire structural weight of a relationship, convincing yourself that your extra effort is simply what loyalty, kindness, and dedication look like. You tell yourself that people are just busy, distracted, or going through a tough phase, and so you continue to overcompensate, carrying both sides of the bridge all by yourself. When you exist in that mode, you rarely stop to assess whether the bridge actually meets anything on the other side. You become so accustomed to initiating, pursuing, and repairing that you do not even realize the dynamic has become completely asymmetrical. You measure the health of the connection by its continued existence, completely ignoring the fact that if you were to stop reaching out for just 2 weeks, the entire relationship would quietly cease to exist. Carrying that continuous responsibility takes a massive toll on your emotional battery. It leaves you feeling subtly drained, unappreciated, and perpetually dissatisfied, though you might struggle to put your finger on why. You end up waiting around for messages that rarely arrive, waiting for invitations that are never extended, and holding space for people who never think to ask how you are actually doing. As you gain clarity and deepen your self-respect, you start paying attention to reciprocity. You stop relying on potential or old memories of how a connection used to be, and you begin looking at the reality of the present interaction. You notice when the balance is off, not out of a spirit of keeping score or keeping a transactional tally, but out of a genuine desire for healthy, mutual engagement. You realize that a real connection requires 2 active participants, and that continuously overfunctioning to compensate for someone else's total absence of effort is not kindness. It is an act of self-neglect. When you see this clearly, your behavior shifts. Instead of trying harder, sending longer messages, or pushing even more intensely to fix a dynamic that is falling apart, you learn to do something far more powerful. You simply step back. Stepping back does not mean making a grand, dramatic exit, starting a confrontation, or delivering a fiery speech about how you have been mistreated. It is a quiet, dignified choice to match the other person's level of investment. You stop initiating every single interaction. You stop rushing in to fill the awkward silences or constantly fixing problems that you did not create. You allow the natural space between you and the other person to exist. And you watch what happens in that space. If the connection quietly fades away, the moment you stop pulling all the weight, you receive a clear and definitive answer about where you actually stood. Accepting that answer can be painful, but it is also profoundly liberating. Choosing not to hold up a dynamic single-handedly is not an act of bitterness or resentment. It is an act of recognizing your own worth. It is an acknowledgement that your time, emotional energy, and genuine care are valuable assets that deserve to be met with equal effort, care, and consideration. When you stop feeding one-sided connections, you suddenly free up an enormous amount of mental capacity that was previously consumed by strain and subtle disappointment. You create room in your life for interactions that feel light, natural, and genuinely mutual. Connections where you never have to question if you belong, because the effort to keep the door open flows easily from both sides. Walking away from one-sided dynamics is ultimately the realization that you deserve relationships where you are met halfway, rather than ones where you must continuously abandon yourself just to keep the connection alive. Remember when every small misunderstanding felt like a that needed to be put out immediately? There was likely a time in your life when you felt a sharp, urgent need to respond to every piece of criticism, defend your reputation, and ensure that every single person understood your side of the story. If someone misinterpreted your words, made an unfair assumption, or raised their voice, your instinct was to step right into the arena. You spent hours drafting mentally exhausting responses, rehearsing arguments in the shower, and pacing around your room, fully convinced that leaving a disagreement unresolved was a form of defeat. You treated every opinion as a direct challenge to your character, believing that if you just explained yourself clearly enough, forcefully enough, or logically enough, you could force the other person to see the truth and validate your perspective. Living in that reactive state is like leaving all your windows open in a dust storm. You end up letting every passing gust of external chaos blow straight into your internal space. When you treat every conflict as an urgent emergency, your central nervous system stays on high alert, constantly scanning for threats, friction, and disrespect. You waste immense amounts of mental bandwidth analyzing subtle tone shifts in text messages, picking apart offhand comments made by acquaintances, and trying to win debates with people who have zero interest in actually understanding you. The urge to win every argument usually comes from an unexamined belief that your self-worth depends on external consensus. You feel that if someone leaves an interaction holding a negative opinion of you, it somehow diminishes who you actually are. With time, maturity, and a deeper commitment to your own well-being, that frantic urge to participate in every argument completely vanishes. You undergo a profound shift in perspective, realizing that your peace of mind is far too valuable to be traded for the temporary satisfaction of getting the last word. You begin to understand that not every opinion requires a response, not every bait needs to be taken, and not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected. You start recognizing the difference between a constructive conversation that aims for mutual resolution and a dramatic spectacle designed only to consume your energy. When you see that someone is looking for a fight rather than a solution, you no longer feel compelled to provide them with an opponent. Choosing quiet over being right slowly becomes your second nature. You learn the quiet power of a neutral smile, a simple nod, or a calm, "You are entitled to your perspective." You realize that allowing someone to misunderstand you is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of ultimate self-assurance. You do not need to convert everyone to your point of view because your internal reality no longer depends on their approval or comprehension. When someone hurls an accusation or projects their own frustration onto you, you let it fall to the ground instead of picking it up and carrying it around. You recognize that their behavior is a reflection of their internal state, not an accurate measure of your value. When you consistently choose to protect your internal calm, you naturally filter out a massive amount of unnecessary friction. The environment around you becomes noticeably quieter, not because the outside world stopped being noisy, but because you stopped inviting that noise inside. You stop entering spaces where chaos is the norm, and you stop entertaining conversations that circle endlessly without bringing any real value to your life. You realize that true strength is not displayed by how loudly you can shout or how effectively you can dismantle someone else's argument. It is demonstrated by your ability to remain completely undisturbed in the middle of noise. Outgrowing unnecessary conflict allows you to conserve your energy for the things that genuinely matter, building a stable life, nurturing healthy relationships, and maintaining an unshakable sense of quiet confidence. We have all experienced those quiet, subtle moments where something immediately felt off, even if we could not pinpoint a clear reason why. Maybe you met someone new and felt an inexplicable knot in your stomach, or perhaps you walked into a situation and felt a sudden, distinct drop in your energy. In the past, your immediate instinct was likely to dismiss those early signals. You talked yourself out of your own discomfort because everything looked perfect on paper, or because you did not want to appear judgmental, paranoid, or difficult. You rationalized away your hesitation, telling yourself that you were overthinking, being unreasonable, or jumping to conclusions without enough concrete evidence. You demanded that your intuition present a fully documented legal brief before you would allow yourself to respect your own internal limits. This pattern of overriding your first impression usually stems from a habit of prioritizing external appearances over your internal reality. You were likely taught to trust logic, surface-level politeness, and social expectations long before you were taught to trust your own gut responses. When a situation seemed fine on the surface, you forced yourself to ignore the quiet alarm ringing inside you, ignoring the tension in your shoulders or the sudden urge to pull back. You waited for tangible proof, a broken promise, an explicit line crossed, or an undeniable conflict to validate what your body had already recognized within the very first few seconds. By the time that external proof finally arrived, you were often left picking up the pieces of a mess you saw coming miles away, feeling a deep sense of frustration. Not just with the situation, but with yourself for ignoring your own warning system. As you develop greater self-awareness and deepen your personal boundaries, you stop demanding endless external proof for internal truths. You begin to understand that your initial instincts are not arbitrary fears or irrational anxieties. They are rapid, highly refined processing systems built on your cumulative life experience. Your subconscious mind notices subtle inconsistencies in tone, fleeting expressions, micro-shifting dynamics, and underlying patterns far faster than your analytical mind can process them. When your gut signals discomfort, it is not asking for a debate. It is providing you with vital information designed to keep your life stable and clear. Learning to trust your initial instincts requires you to stop second-guessing those early signals the moment they appear. You learn to honor your internal compass the first time it speaks up, rather than waiting for a dramatic situation to prove that your feelings were justified all along. Accepting your own perspective without needing validation from anyone else is one of the clearest, most undeniable markers of true self-respect. When you feel a boundary needs to be set, you set it. When you feel a situation is no longer safe or healthy for your peace of mind, you step away without needing to construct a massive list of excuses. You stop asking other people to confirm whether your gut feeling is correct, recognizing that your internal comfort level is the only authority you need to consult. When you consistently honor your initial reactions, the way you navigate the world transforms. You save yourself from months of unnecessary stress, draining interactions, and complicated situations simply by respecting the subtle no that showed up in the very beginning. You stop walking into dynamics, hoping they will prove your instincts wrong, and instead start walking with the quiet confidence of someone who listens to their own internal guidance. Trusting yourself the first time does not mean you become hostile or suspicious. It simply means you become aligned. You realize that your intuition is a quiet protector, and by listening to it immediately, you maintain an unshakable, peaceful standard for what you choose to allow into your personal world. It is an incredibly common human experience to want to step in and fix things when you see someone you care about struggling. In the past, you were likely the person who automatically took on the role of the caretaker, the problem solver, or the emotional manager in almost every dynamic. Whenever a friend, partner, or family member faced a crisis, your immediate instinct was to jump straight into action mode. You spent hours listening to their circular problems, offering carefully researched advice, brainstorming step-by-step solutions, and trying to manage outcomes on their behalf. You carried their emotional stress in your own body, staying up late at night, worrying about their choices, and feeling a heavy sense of personal responsibility if their lives were not going smoothly. This intense desire to fix everything often stems from a deeply ingrained belief that your personal safety and comfort are tied to the emotional stability of everyone around you. You learned somewhere along the way that if the people in your environment were stressed, anxious, or unfulfilled, it was your job to repair the mood so that you could finally feel secure. Taking control of other people's problems becomes a subtle coping mechanism, a way to manage your own internal discomfort by managing their external chaos. You tell yourself that you are just being helpful, supportive, and compassionate. But underneath that good intention lies a subtle, exhausting attempt to control outcomes that were never yours to manage in the first place. When you live as a chronic fixer, you end up overstepping healthy boundaries without even realizing it. You inadvertently signal to others that you do not trust them to handle their own challenges, while simultaneously robbing them of the exact friction they need to grow. Every time you jump in to cushion someone's fall, solve their dilemmas, or shield them from the natural consequences of their choices, you deny them the opportunity to build resilience and resourcefulness. Furthermore, taking on burdens that belong to someone else eventually leads to severe emotional burnout and quiet resentment. You find yourself exhausted and depleted, wondering why you are putting 10 times more effort into solving their problems than they are putting into solving them themselves. As you mature and deepen your self-awareness, you begin to understand where your personal sphere of influence ends and another person's journey begins. You realize that true compassion is not about swooping in to rescue people from their discomfort. It is about standing beside them while honoring their autonomy to navigate their own path. You start recognizing that every individual has their own timing, their own lessons to absorb, and their own responsibility to step up for themselves. Allowing people to experience the outcomes of their own choices, even when it is painful to watch, is healthier, more respectful, and far more honest for both them and you. Releasing the fix-it mindset requires a conscious, daily practice of stepping back and staying in your own lane. When someone shares a problem with you, you learn to ask simple, grounding questions like, "Are you looking for advice, or do you just need space to vent?" instead of offering unsolicited solutions. You practice sitting with the temporary awkwardness of letting someone else hold their own heavy feelings without rushing in to make everything better. You realize that you can be a supportive, caring presence in someone's life without becoming their personal shock absorber. When you stop trying to repair every broken situation around you, an immense weight lifts off your shoulders. You free up a massive amount of mental energy that was previously consumed by managing external dynamics. You begin to direct that focus inward, cultivating your own life, protecting your own peace, and building a secure foundation for yourself. Letting go of the urge to fix everything is not an act of coldness or indifference. It is the ultimate expression of emotional maturity. It is the recognition that you are only responsible for your own choices, your own reactions, and your own life, and that letting others carry their own weight is the greatest form of respect you can offer. There was likely a time in your life when you believed that being a supportive person meant total, unconditional self-sacrifice. You operated under the assumption that true loyalty required you to drop whatever you were doing the exact moment someone called, regardless of how exhausted, busy, or mentally drained you were. If a friend needed an audience for a 3-hour late-night vent session, you stayed awake, ignoring your early morning commitments and your own need for sleep. If a family member expected you to accommodate their emotional volatile swings or step into their personal chaos, you rearranged your entire schedule, your priorities, and your personal boundaries just to make sure they felt heard and comforted. You equated love and support with how much of yourself you were willing to give away, measuring your value as a friend, partner, or family member by how much personal discomfort you could quietly endure for their sake. This intense, self-effacing model of support often comes from a deep-seated fear of being seen as cold, selfish, or unloving. You learned to prioritize the comfort and validation of others over your own basic physical and emotional limits. When you live with this mindset, offering support does not bring a sense of healthy connection. It leaves you feeling entirely depleted, silently resentful, and utterly overwhelmed. You begin to dread the ringing of your phone, the notification icons on your screen, or the arrival of certain people into your space, because you know that interacting with them means completely abandoning your own needs. You end up creating an environment where your presence is available to everyone else, but completely inaccessible to yourself. As you do the work of personal growth and boundary setting, your entire understanding of what it means to support someone undergoes a fundamental transformation. You start to see that true support is never built on a foundation of self-destruction. You realize that sacrificing your own well-being to temporarily soothe someone else's discomfort does not actually help them in a meaningful, long-term way. It simply creates a codependent dynamic where you burn yourself out to keep them warm. Real support requires clear, respected limits, both for you and for the people you care about. You begin to understand that being a reliable, solid presence in someone's life does not mean being available every single second of the day, nor does it mean agreeing to absorb their emotional toxicity whenever they feel like projecting it. Redefining support means shifting from reactive rescue attempts to sustainable, grounded presence. It means learning to offer genuine empathy while holding a steady line around your own energy. You learn to say simple, honest statements like, "I care about you and want to hear about this, but I am completely drained tonight. Can we talk about this tomorrow, when I can actually give you my full attention?" This approach honors both the connection and your own human limits. It demonstrates that you respect the other person enough to offer them your presence when you are actually capable of giving it, rather than presenting a hollow, exhausted version of yourself out of pure obligation. When you hold this standard, you also encourage the people around you to step into their own strength. You stop acting as a constant emotional buffer, and instead, you become an example of what self-respect and healthy balance look like. You teach people how to interact with you in a way that is clean, sustainable, and mutually respectful. Those who genuinely value your presence will adapt to these standards, learning to respect your time and boundaries, just as you respect theirs. Those who only valued your total self-sacrifice will naturally drift away, or protest, revealing that they were more interested in what you could give them than who you actually were. Ultimately, redefining support is about realizing that your energy, time, and mental space are valuable, non-renewable resources that must be managed with intention. It is the understanding that you cannot pour from an empty cup, and that protecting your own peace is the precise thing that allows you to offer authentic, meaningful support when it truly matters. When you anchor yourself in this truth, your relationships shift from draining obligations to healthy, balanced connections built on mutual care and genuine respect. There was likely a time in your life when any sudden lull in a conversation felt like an absolute emergency that needed to be fixed immediately. You might remember the distinct internal panic that flared up whenever a quiet pause stretched past a few seconds, the uncomfortable tension, the sudden spike in self-consciousness, and the desperate scramble in your mind to find literally anything to say just to keep the dialogue going. You filled those spaces with nervous chatter, shallow small talk, oversharing details about your week, or asking trivial questions you didn't particularly care about, all to shield yourself and the other person from the quiet. You operated under the implicit assumption that silence between two people was a sign of failure, an awkward indicator that the connection was lacking, or a signal that you were somehow failing as an engaging, entertaining companion. This intense aversion to silence often stems from a deep-seated need to perform and manage external impressions. When you feel insecure in your own presence or unsure of your standing with someone else, quietness feels like a mirror exposing an underlying rift. You treat social interactions as a stage where continuous noise is the only proof of a successful bond. But performing in this way requires a continuous stream of mental energy. You spend entire gatherings on edge, monitoring the room's energy, anticipating the next lull, and exhausting yourself just to maintain an artificial flow. You end up participating in loud, frantic interactions that feel performative and shallow, trading genuine depth for the temporary comfort of surface-level noise. As you grow in self-awareness and deepen your self-respect, your relationship with silence changes entirely. You begin to recognize the vast, undeniable difference between genuine, effortless connection and forced verbal noise. You start to notice how much energy is squandered on hollow exchanges that exist solely to keep awkwardness at bay. When you become comfortable and secure in who you are, you no longer feel compelled to perform or keep up appearances for anyone. You stop viewing quietness as a failure of communication and start seeing it as a space of comfort, truth, and rest. You realize that true intimacy, whether in a friendship, a romantic relationship, or a family bond, is not measured by how fast you can talk over each other, but by how easily you can sit together without needing to say a word at all. Shifting toward comfortable silence completely alters the standard for how you choose to spend your time and who you share it with. You begin seeking out spaces and connections where silence is light, natural, and grounded. You look for people with whom you can share a room, ride in a car, or sit over a cup of coffee without any pressure to manufacture constant dialogue. In these authentic dynamics, quietness does not feel heavy or tense. It feels like an unspoken understanding, a shared state of ease where both individuals are allowed to simply exist without performing. Conversely, when you find yourself in environments where every pause feels strained, unnatural, or demanding, you recognize it as a signal that the dynamic requires an unsustainable amount of effort just to maintain a basic level of interaction. Choosing comfortable silence over forced conversation is a natural byproduct of raising your standards and honoring your energy. It allows you to step away from the exhausting cycle of social performance and move toward interactions that leave you feeling grounded rather than drained. You learn that it is entirely fine to let a conversation rest, to give thoughts time to settle, and to leave space empty when there is nothing meaningful left to say. Protecting your peace means refusing to fill your world with empty noise simply to make others feel comfortable. When you anchor yourself in this truth, you naturally cultivate a life surrounded by genuine, calm dynamics where you are accepted not for how well you can entertain, but for the steady, quiet presence you bring to the table. Time is the one completely non-renewable resource you possess, yet it is often the very first thing you give away freely, without a second thought. Think back to how frequently you used to hand over your precious hours and mental clarity to demands that held zero real value for your life. You might remember saying yes to unnecessary meetings, lingering in exhausting group chats, or agreeing to weekend plans you actively dreaded, simply because someone asked, and you felt a heavy, automatic pressure to comply. You spent your energy putting out other people's fire drills, answering every notification instantly, and letting your day be dictated by whichever request happened to land in your lap first. You operated as if your time belonged to the public, treating your own goals, rest, and personal projects as secondary items that could always be pushed to the side. Living with an open, unprotected schedule creates a perpetual state of quiet exhaustion and internal fragmentation. When you allow every external demand to pull at your attention, your mental focus becomes scattered into dozens of unproductive directions. You spend your days constantly context switching, rushing from one obligation to another, and reacting to external noise rather than taking deliberate, intentional action. The ultimate cost of this open-door policy is not just a busy calendar. It is the slow, steady erosion of your long-term ambitions and personal stability. You wake up month after month feeling like you are constantly working, helping, and moving, yet realizing you have made virtually no meaningful progress on the things that actually matter to your own future. As your self-awareness deepens and your standards elevate, your relationship with your time and attention undergoes a radical transformation. You stop treating your focus as a casual commodity and start viewing it as the primary currency of your life. You begin to understand that every time you say an automatic yes to something unimportant, you are simultaneously saying a firm no to your rest, your goals, your peace, and your personal development. You realize that protecting your time is not about being cold, rigid, or antisocial. It is about establishing a secure, well-defined perimeter around your life so that you can show up fully for the priorities you explicitly choose to cultivate. Protecting your time and focus requires a conscious practice of intentional boundary setting and intentional friction. You learn to pause before making commitments, replacing the frantic urge to agree with grounded phrases like, "Let me check my schedule and get back to you," or a simple, dignified, "I don't have the capacity for that right now." You start treating your calendar as a private workspace rather than a public bulletin board. You establish deep focus windows where your phone is on silent, notifications are disabled, and external demands are placed on hold. You stop feeling guilty for taking a few hours or an entire afternoon just to read, think, build, or simply recharge your battery in quiet, solitary space. When you consistently enforce these standards, the clutter in your life naturally begins to clear away. People who were accustomed to your instant availability might be surprised or disappointed when you no longer respond immediately to every non-urgent message or request. But as you hold your line, a remarkable shift occurs. People learn to respect your time precisely because you respect it yourself. Your focus becomes sharp, your days become calm, and your progress on long-term endeavors accelerates exponentially. Protecting your time and focus is ultimately the highest form of self-stewardship. It is the steady, daily commitment to ensuring that the limited hours of your life are dedicated to building a peaceful, purposeful reality of your own design. The journey of personal growth and self-discovery is often misunderstood as a process of reaching a magical destination, a quiet state of absolute perfection where nothing ever bothers you, no one ever pushes your limits, and every single moment flows smoothly. But true maturity is not about escaping the friction of daily life or transforming into an unfeeling, detached observer. It is about fundamentally changing how you relate to your present reality and how you respond when the world tries to pull you backward into old habits. It is the realization that setting boundaries, raising your standards, and valuing your peace are not temporary projects you complete once and then forget about. They are daily, intentional choices to anchor yourself firmly in who you are right now, regardless of the noise surrounding you. In the past, you may have spent an immense amount of energy attempting to squeeze your present self back into spaces you had long outgrown. You might have found yourself returning to old social circles, familiar relationship dynamics, or outdated work environments, desperately trying to force the comfortable connections of the past to fit your current awareness. You minimized your progress, softened your opinions, and swallowed your growth just to keep from making others feel uncomfortable or exposed by your evolution. You tried to play a smaller, more agreeable version of yourself, hoping that if you diluted your boundaries enough, you could preserve connections that were built for a person you no longer were. But abandoning your present reality to appease the past only generates a deep, painful, internal friction that eventually becomes impossible to ignore. Standing firm in your present reality means accepting that growth naturally alters your landscape. It requires the courage to look at your life as it exists today, without nostalgia, without denial, and without apologizing for the standards you have developed along the way. You acknowledge that holding higher standards will inevitably change your relationships. Some people will appreciate your clarity and step up to meet you with equal respect and maturity, while others will resist, complain, or quietly drift away. When you are firmly grounded in your present self, you accept this natural sorting process without panic or bitterness. You stop trying to force open doors that are meant to stay closed, and you stop dragging outdated dynamics into your current chapter simply because they feel familiar.